All right. Hello, everybody. So, what I want to work on today is Steve designed this little draft published sort of drop-down widget for publishing products. So as it stands, there's no way for us to actually publish a product. The only way that I do it is by just going directly into the database, and just swapping over, basically setting this published at timestamp manually. So that's how I've been kind of testing it locally. But for the real thing, of course, we want people to be able to do that themselves through the UI. So we have this mock-up here of how it's generally going to work. And I spent a little bit of time kind of starting on like a little proof of concept version of it. So I'll walk through kind of how this is working right now. And also then we'll work on kind of doing this element of it. Instead of using a button, we'll have this sort of draft published thing that'll say draft or published, whether or not it's draft or published, and the right thing will be checked off and stuff like that. So there's going to be a lot of things for us to kind of figure out here. So yeah, let's figure it out. Yeah, we could make that say publish instead of published. It's hard to say because, like, if it's already published, then what does the draft one say? Does it say like draftify or like make draft or something? Seems like tricky to be consistent there. One thing that's kind of weird is it looks like the rounded corners aren't working the way I would expect on this box here. Something doesn't look quite right there. When it's not overlapping, you can see it looks like it's got like a hard edge. So maybe this does say it has a rounded, it should be rounded B. That's why. Yeah, okay, that looks better. Okay, so anyways, let's look at some code so far. So the way that this generally is working is you have a Vue component called a publish button. And if we go to like the product edit view, you can see here, I'm just dropping in this publish button. It's got no props or anything yet because it's just kind of like a mock-up proof of concept thing. So it has a container that's position relative so that we can use it as an anchor for the popover element. And it's got just a plain old button in there that toggles whether or not this element should be showing. And this element here is the actual drop-down that we're seeing here that I was kind of hacking on and figuring out how I was going to do it. So it has some utility classes. We use the max z-index that I have in my z-index scale to make sure that nothing ever overlaps it below if we ever have anything here that's at a higher z-index level. Position absolute, right 0. I think we can actually replace those with utilities. So we can say absolute pin R. And let's fix that rounded bottom to be rounded B for this for now. Let's see where that gets us. So it looks basically the same. Cool. So there's so many things to do here that I'm having a hard time deciding where to start. So why don't we try seeding this thing? Well, first of all, why don't we try and work on the little button that we have in the sketch file here instead of having like the green button. And then I think we'll try and seed it with some data so we can actually have it show the multiple different states that we want it to have. Okay, so it looks like we also have like a little bit of margin between these two. I don't know if Steve really did that super intentionally or if he doesn't really care. But we can do that pretty easily. I have a utility class I've been using. So I have all these utility classes for my margin and spacers, right? And you won't probably be able to tell very easily looking at this file what they look like. But suffice to say, I have a spacing scale. So I can do stuff like MB1 is going to be margin bottom, where 1 represents the first element on the spacer scale. So it's going to be 0.25 rems in this case. But But I also added a PX helper because once in a while you have to do just a 1 pixel shift. And this happens a lot when you want to get like overlapping borders or things like that. So I added this MBPX thing. So by adding that, we should get that like little 1 pixel gap between them that Steve kind of had in his mock-up. Okay, so let's take this button and think about how we want it to be styled. So I think it makes sense for it to be an actual button element. It's hard to say. Let's not do that at first because I'm worried that there's going to be too much styling we're going to have to defeat. So let's start by just making it a div for now. And this will start by saying drafts, and we're going to have like an icon in there, right? Which is like the little down chevron icon. So I don't know if I already have an icon for that. So let's see if I've already exported one. Icons. Doesn't look like it. So I don't know if Steve is using his Zondicons stuff here, but let's use that for our own here. So he's got one right here that I can pull in quickly. So we'll just stick that in there. We'll give it a class of icon. And instead of styling this as a button, let's give it a border, and we'll make it rounded, and it'll have a light background. And that should be like enough to kind of get it looking pretty close-ish. No? This type equals button is probably biting us here. We don't want a div with a type of button. Okay, so that's sort of okay. That chevron is not the right one. Let's check if there's a Zondicon down arrow that looks like this sort of arrow that Steve has there. If not, we can export it from Sketch and quickly optimize it. Let's just do that. Oop, wrong thing. Okay, so let's export this as an SVG. It's a combined shape, eh? Let's find out why. Okay, seems fine. So we'll just export that to downloads for a second here, because we're just going to copy the code that we generate out of SVG OMG anyways. Oh, I didn't know that you could copy the SVG that way. That's cool. All right. All right, so let's just copy that and see what the resulting thing looks like. We might have to tweak a thing or two. Let's get rid of the fill because we'll just let that inherit from the text color. View box is fine. It's kind of weird that it's 10 by 6 actually, but we'll see what happens. How does this look? Way too big. Wonder why that's not getting oh, it's because, yeah, the view box thing is a problem. Okay, so let's forget about using that icon. I'll get Steve to export proper ones. Instead, we'll just use like this version of it. Cool. For now. And we're going to need a bunch of padding on this. So let's do like PX4, PY2, something like that. And see where that gets us. It's a little bit tall. Maybe we want like PX6. And we actually might want to position that chevron differently. Okay, so that seems like close-ish for the actual text positioning, but text needs to be a different weight. So I'll make that like, I think it's like text medium. Let's see actually what font weight Steve's using here. Bold. Okay, so we'll use bold. And I think that's too dark. I think we want like text dark soft here. Yeah, that's looking a little bit better. And we'll make this icon text dark softer. Again, it's going to look better when we get the real icon in there. Now, let's think about how we want to space these out. It seems kind of funky to just change like the left and right padding to be different amounts, but I think we can roll with that for now. And maybe this will have like MR2 or something. Just kind of see what that gives us. I mean, feels a little off. Let's try a little bit less on the left. Yeah, it seems close. I'd be willing to roll with this. So we're gonna give this a roll of button at least, which I think will automatically, if I still have my reset set up the way I had before, we'll get the pointer cursor on it so it'll feel clickable. All right. The problem is if you double click, you get the selection happening. So that's something that we don't want. So I have this helper called noSelect. That when you stick that on something, it prevents the text from getting selected when you double click it and stuff. So we'll start with everything kind of set up this way. I think eventually probably this whole thing will graduate into like a real component with its own styles. So I don't have to kind of jerk around like this. But now it kind of works the way I would kind of hope it would work. So it doesn't highlight when we double click it or anything like that. It'd be nice to be able to get it so that we could click off here and have it close. But that's trickier to do by hand than you would think. But we could look into that. But let's not worry about that quite yet. So this is set to noSelect too, but I think we probably want to have a pointer cursor. Do we? Let's think. Let's see what happens if we give this like an is clickable helper. See if it feels better. Is that even my helper? Let's check out miscellaneous, I think is where some of this kind of a junk drawer for things. Okay, so just dot clickable. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that feels kind of accurate to me. Cool. All right, so let's think about kind of getting this to be seated with the right state. So this looks like sort of right for this one because it is a draft. But if we go to like one of these products, this shows up as draft even though in the database everything is set to be published. Whoop. Let's see. So yeah, that's set to be published, right? So we're going to want to seed this button. And there's two ways we could do it. We could either just like seed it with like the current state and whether or not it's publishable, because that's going to affect whether, you know, if the data that's needed to make it published is not there, then we're going to want this to be disabled. View click away. Cool. I'll look into that. But I think what I would rather do is just seed it with the whole product and kind of keep the logic for extracting the right things out of the product inside there. So let's think about how we want this to work. I think we want to be able to have like a helper on the array version of the product that says its published state. So maybe it'll just have like a published true or false. So let's look at like our product and see, do we have like a toArray override on this already? No. Do we have anything that says published? So the only thing that we have checking for publishing stuff is a scope. So let's add a unit test for the product, because I don't think we actually have one yet, because basically everything we've been doing with the product has been through feature tests, but this isn't really a feature test level thing. So I'm just going to create a new product test.php tests unit, and we'll have to use database migrations, and let's think about what we want to call the test. Well, no, it doesn't want to autocomplete this time. Sometimes tab works, sometimes I have to use enter. I don't know. So basically we want to be able to check whether or not a product is published, right? So let's write a test called that. Can check if a product is published. So maybe we'll just batch a couple of different situations into this one test. So let's have like a published product equals factory product class states publishable, because I need to make sure I don't want to do anything funky where I'm trying to mark a product as published that doesn't have all the data needed to be published. And we'll give this a published at date. Let's just do carbon now. I have to import that. And we should be able to assert true, published product is published. And this should fail because we haven't done anything there. Okay, so we gotta import the product class, run it again, call undefined method assert true. Okay, so we should probably learn to type. Call undefined method is published. Okay, so let's head over to the product and add an is published method. Let's think about where we could put it. Let's put it with the scope because they're all kind of like related. So we'll add is published. For now, this will just return true, so we can kind of force ourselves to implement the other side of this test. So that's green. So let's add another product here. Unpublished product, which is not publishable, and it's got a null published at date explicitly. And then we can insert false that that's published. Oh. Run that, should fail. Okay. So now we can just return this published at does not equal null. We could make sure published at is in the past. I think that's not really necessary because we're not going to support the ability to like schedule the publishing of a product. And I don't really want to imply that. So as long as it's not null, then that means someone tried to publish it. And the only way that field can ever get set is through the UI, which is always going to set it to the current timestamp. So there's not going to be any way of setting it in the future anyways. So I think that's going to be fine with me. Okay, failed asserting that true is false. Interesting. Did I typo something? Oh, I used the wrong product. Okay, cool. So that's looking good. Let's test the array structure of it. So we'll add a test here and we'll call it converting to an array. And we're going to want to create like a published product probably and specify a bunch of fields on it. We'll have to think about what ones we want. I don't want to get too carried away there, so I think I'm actually just going to start with just the fields that we actually care about. Let's do an assert equals. We'll have an array that we want to be able to convert it to. When I'm dealing with arrays with Eloquent, like converting things to JSON and stuff like that, I basically never rely on like the visible or hidden properties or any of that stuff. I pretty much always just override to array manually and specify the things that I want, because a lot of the time I'm adding fields that are like computed properties that don't really exist in the table and stuff. It ends up being a lot more straightforward to just override it completely and have complete control than fiddling with like the little properties to try and configure it. So let's take this, well, we won't call it publish product, we'll just call it product. Let's convert it to an array. Oh shit. Product test. It's harder to see the keyboard with this big mic in my face and I typo things or hit the wrong key. Okay, so at least two things here. We probably are going to need to have an ID. So we'll just have the product ID come out there. And then I think we'll say published is going to be true. And we might need some more stuff later when we want to basically be able to say like we might want like a publishable thing, which basically is like a way of tracking the validation state. So we know what to show in that dropdown, like whether it's enabled or disabled. And then we also might want to keep track of like a message or something that explains why it's not publishable. But for now, we're going to leave that out because we don't need it quite yet. And I'm also going to leave out the name and all that other stuff because I just literally don't need any of that yet for any reason. Okay, so it's turning a bunch of crap that we don't need. So let's add to array. I always stick to array right at the bottom. And this might have to be compatible with like the Eloquent models to array. Okay, it doesn't have any parameters. It's the JSON one that has parameters. Okay, so then we're just going to return an array of the stuff that we want to return. So we'll have an ID, which is going to be this ID. And then published is going to be this is published. So this is an example of like why it can be useful to just override to array manually, because published is not a column, right? Published at is a column. But I don't really care to expose the published at timestamp for like JavaScript clients. Really, they just need to know, is it published or is it not published? So by doing this totally from scratch, I can kind of just make up this field and have it be computed from a method. Oh no. How do you do that? Like this? Do I also have to type hint the parameter it doesn't take? Like void has a void parameter list? Terrible. Okay. Let's see. All right, so we're green now, so that's fine. So let's pass that in as a prop to our publish button and then just kind of poke around in the browser and see how things are looking. So we'll accept some props here. One will be the product. That'll be the only one, I guess, for now. Then in the edit view, we'll pass that through. So we'll say product is going to be equal to product to JSON. And under the hood, Laravel uses the toArray method that we overrode when you call to JSON. So I feel good about using that just fine. All right, so let's pop open the Vue console here. Just kind of see what we get. Probably some gnarly errors. Oh no, okay, so we got our simple product with just an ID and like a published at published at flag. Cool. So let's make this work. So I'm gonna add some computed stuff here. So we'll have like a computed published. Should we call it published or should we call it is published? I mean, we could just reference the product directly too. We could also make a computed property for like the text. Depends how carried away you want to get, like how much logic you want in your templates versus how much you want to come from computed stuff. Let's just kind of get it working maybe and then think about extracting that sort of thing. So I'm just going to delete this completely for now. Okay, so basically we want to be able to say product.published. If it's published, then we want to have the text published Otherwise, we want to have the text draft. So let's see what we get. Okay, published. And now it's checking off the wrong thing, of course, right? So let's work on that maybe. So this is actually going to be interesting because there's like a whole shit ton of, this is like one of those examples where it would make me want to move from all these composed utilities into like a component because I don't want to be like toggling like this entire class list because this one has a bunch of extra stuff on it that this one doesn't, right? But we'll think about that after. Okay. And I'm gonna, now that this is only a single inline style thing, we'll just do this. Eventually I need to make some width helpers, but for this sort of thing, I don't mind just having a single inline thing. Okay, so since we only want to show the check mark next to the one that's actually active, why don't we copy this? Actually, this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna copy this whole thing, and then change this one to published. Get rid of this one. But it just does sound like we might want to have an MB2 if this is active. So we'll have a fancy Vue class thing where we'll say it needs an MB2 if product.published. And the other one is going to be the opposite. So this is going to get messy with a lot of stuff in the template at first, and then I think we'll do some extracting. Okay, so we have both showing like the exact same thing. So we want to use a different text color for this if the product is not published. So basically, if this one should be active, then I think what we want is like the text dark helper. Now this one's tricky because I don't want to duplicate the logic. Like basically what you would want to do, right? Like there's two ways that you can bind the classes. You can either bind like an array, which might be how we want to do it because we have a little bit, we'd basically be baking conditional logic into the array. I'll show you what I'm trying to say before I kind of talking out loud and not finishing my sentences. But if we had an array here, we could do like, if the product is published, right, then we want nothing for the first item. Otherwise, we want MB2 for the first item. And then you could say, I guess we could just include both of them here, right? So this would just be text dark softer. Otherwise, we want text dark MB2. Can you do two classes? Like, let's just see like what this even does. Okay, so we are editing on this one, which is just not as interesting. So we'll move it down to this one too. So in this case, if the product, we basically just want to reverse these, I think, right? It'll definitely be better to extract these out into like draft classes and published classes or something like that. Still not working the way I think. Okay, so in this case, okay, I think we actually need to get rid of these. Maybe those are defined later in the CSS files. That's probably what's happening. Okay, so this is backwards to what I would expect. If it's published, we want it to be text dark softer. Okay, so we got them flipped around the wrong way. So that means you got to flip these ones around too. All right, getting there. Okay, so this one should be disabled. We also should have no help text here because the product is already published. And the SVG thing should only even be visible if that condition is true. So with the draft one, we'll do a vshow if vshow not product.published, and this one will be if it's published. And same sort of thing on this p tag, but it's going to be the opposite. All right, some complex logic. Okay, so that's basically what I want, but we also don't want this to be selectable. The one that we want to be selectable is whatever one is active, right? And this has an MB2. That shouldn't have one. Oh, no, it should, because we're going to have some helper text under there, too. Let's duplicate this helper text and reverse the conditional. Okay. So let's change this. Even this text is going to be different depending on whether it's active or inactive, based on, I think it was Florian's recommendation, which I think actually is a good one. Oh, man, there's so many conditionals. It's going to be interesting to find ways to abstract out of this. For now, maybe let's just not change the text, but just worry about making the right one clickable. Okay, so all of the helpers for making it selectable are basically going to be, oh, we got double there. Whoops. I think it's just these hover ones, these hover helpers, and like the clickable thing. Okay, so let's make a computed property for that. And think about what to call it. So what would we call something that kind of lists all the clickable classes or something, like the active option classes or something. Let's call it active. Yeah, active option. It's not really like an option, but like only one of the two is ever going to be clickable, right? I guess option isn't that bad. So we'll call it that. All right, so here we can say class, and I guess again, like the array syntax will be the easier one to do here. And if it's not published, okay, so if product is published, we don't want to show anything. Otherwise, we want to show the clickable option classes or active option classes. Actually, I think I like clickable option classes because that's less confusing. Because active sounds like the one that's currently selected, which is not what we're actually doing here. Whew. All right, we'll keep chugging through here and see where we end up. So now in this case, we basically want to flip these around. So we get something like that. Okay, so we're missing the text color for those two options, which again is another good sign that we should be creating real components for this stuff where there's a little bit more knowledge about like the surroundings. Because otherwise we have to basically duplicate the logic to calculate the hover state for these. I wonder where I was having that work before. I must have deleted it. But basically, we need to add that list here. So I think it would be like, if it's published, then this one's selectable, right? So it would be like hover text light. And I think it'd be the same thing there. So that should at least get the headings flipping over. Oh, but that's on the one thing there. I wonder how I was doing that before. Because you don't want it to be just on that one element. I must have been doing something. I'm kind of curious now. Hover BG highlight. You know what it must have been? It must have just been, I must have not had text colors specified on either of these two. And I was just kind of getting lucky. So this will definitely need to be a component. Why don't we do that and just kind of show you my workflow for that. So if you go into the components directory here, we'll have to come up with an interesting name for it, which is usually the hardest part because this is sort of like a custom UI component. I guess it's like sort of a drop down, but we might have other drop downs that are slightly different. But let's call it drop down anyways, I guess. Drop down menu. Or even like a drop down button. I think Dropdown Button sounds cool. So we'll create a new file in dropdownbutton.less. And then basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this publish button component. And I'm going to think about what classes should go kind of where. So it looks like we have this thing with like a position relative, and for a drop down to work, that's important. So that should be baked into the component probably. So it's tricky to think about what that should be called. We'll probably call it like a drop down button container or wrapper. And this is the cool thing about using less with this like utility approach, is that since everything is built out of utilities, I literally can just use those utilities. So I can say, okay, well, that should be position relative. So I just mix in that existing utility. Then for the actual drop-down button itself, we can just take all of these classes, paste those in. We'll do some Sublime magic here to split those up onto separate lines. There, that's done. So we got all the classes for that. So we should be able to replace this relative with a drop-down button wrapper. And then this can be a drop-down button. And I'm not convinced that I want to specify these classes in the component. Like especially not the icon one or the text arc softer. Yeah, basically none of those. The only one that I could think that might be reasonable to put in there would be maybe these two. But I think I'm still happy to just have you specify what text color you want there. So now this section, what would we call that? It would basically be like the drop down. I'm going to use drop-down button as the prefix because that's like the main component. But it's sort of like the drop-down button list. Something like that. Or drop-down button popover. Today I am working on this kind of interactive little publishing widget thing. So we're trying to simplify how some of it works right now and moving from utilities, kind of promoting a bunch of utilities into a component so that we have some better fine-grained control of some of the styling when it comes to how things interact, especially with different states. Okay, so I feel pretty comfortable extracting all of these. So we'll call this a Dropdown Button popover. I paste all those in. Okay. Let's just kind of make sure that we haven't like broken things too much here. Everything still seems to be working the way it was before. Okay, so yeah, this one is kind of tricky because some of it is sort of specific, like in terms of the fact that certain things can be disabled. This is going to have like a selected option. So it's almost more like a Dropdown Picker or something, because it's not like a menu where like you're just always going to click into different things. But let's not stress about it too much. I think I'll bake in this width too. So this will be one thing that's not coming from a utility. So that's kind of nice. And now each one of these is basically a drop-down button popover item. I think we'll just call them like drop-down button items or something. Okay, so we'll do drop-down button option, maybe? Drop-down button option. And we're going to have to use some like first child sort of stuff here, because you can see this one has a full-on border and a rounded top, but only the first one is going to have a full-on border and a rounded top. So let's do that here. First child, border, rounded top. It's weird that I used a different padding for those. Seems kind of dumb. So we'll just stick with the 2 for now. And then this one has border right, border left, and border bottom. But a rounded bottom. So the rounded bottom, at least, is only because of the last child. So let's do rounded B for that one. But what borders are different for the bottom one? I almost wonder if like the right way to do it is to... It's kind of tricky actually because of the way I want the hover states to work, but we'll figure it out. I almost wonder if they should all have full borders except the top and bottom one, where the top one has no bottom border and the bottom one has no top border. Let's see what the border stuff looks like. Do I even have helpers for 0? Yeah, so we want the very first one. I think we'll do border on all of them. But this one will have border B0. And this one will have border T0. Ah, man, don't close my file. And let's just kind of see what happens now if we mix in this drop-down button option class instead. See what we get. Okay, so it still looks the same, which is good. And just to double check that everything's compiling and everything, let's make sure that we're even seeing. Oh man, terrifying. Oh man, very scary. So this whole time, our JavaScript hasn't been compiling. When things go too smoothly, that's always like a fear of mine. So it said it was compiling, but it wasn't. I'm still using Elixir on this project. And I have this problem randomly once in a while where it doesn't notice like a file change. Okay. Okay, so we can't do what we were doing because now we get no border between them. So I think we actually want to have... We'll have to think about that a little bit. So rather than having no bottom border on the first one and no top border on the last one, maybe we want a full border on all of them except the very bottom one. That's probably the right thing to do. Probably not quite, actually. Is this seriously not compiling? Because I think if we have 3 of these items, this is going to break yet again. I think we're going to get a double border. Yeah. So maybe we just want no top border on any of them except the first one. So let's do border L, border R, border B, and we'll do these in the right order. And the very first one will also have a border T. Let's try that approach. And we'll get there. Yeah, that's looking closer. Although the first one doesn't seem to have this top border. Oh yeah, it's there now. Just was a delay. Okay, cool. So that feels right. Now, the things that are complicated are figuring out the hover states for the drop-down options. So basically, we want to be able to say, like, when you're hovering on one of these, the cursor is going to be a pointer cursor, as long as it's active, or is clickable or something, right? Or is selectable. So we'll have to figure that out too. We're going to mix in the BG highlight class, if I'm not mistaken, because that's what's going to give us our blue background color. But then we also want the color of the text to be light. And we want that to work its way down to every child. So I think we're actually going to need more components than we really necessarily might have wanted. Like basically we're going to need a heading component and a body component for each drop-down button option, so that we can feel like there's actually some like relationship here. And then we're going to have to not hard code, but the text color is going to have to become part of this whole thing. So we'll have a drop-down button option title. And yeah, sucky. We might even be able to, we might even want to use CSS to control whether this SVG shows up. Crappy. Okay, so let's just mix everything into here and figure out. I try to avoid like mixing in absolutely everything. I try to think carefully about what are the things that are specific to this implementation or to this one place where this is used versus what stuff is logical to share across every implementation of the component. But we'll start with this. So I think we're going to need like another helper, basically like an and is selected. I don't know if selected is the right word, but like and is maybe disabled. But that's not really right because the check mark will show on the so-called disabled one. So maybe we won't use CSS to hide the check mark. We'll do is disabled. So if it's disabled, which in this case is if it's published, then we're going to want to mix in text dark softer, right? Otherwise, we're just going to have text dark, if I'm not mistaken. And now we're also going to have a... See, I actually don't think we need these flex things built in. If we're not going to bake the icon in, I don't think we need those in there. Dropdown button option body, I guess. And is there anything specific about this? The only reason that I need to be able to change anything here is because of the stupid text color. Ugh. It sucks that I have to be able to target this just to be able to change the text color. Because like I think I would rather just, I guess we'll bake the .text small thing in here, whatever. I can't see a use case where like you wouldn't want this to be small in a drop-down button option. These can stay like that, I think, because we're never going to be hovering and showing a blue background on something with a check mark. So that doesn't really matter. We're still going to want a drop-down button option title here. Just so we have a target for changing the color, basically. And then instead of using this stuff, I think what we can actually do is take this margin bottom 2, get rid of that, and put a margin top 2 on the body. Because when there's no body, then we won't have that push happening. But if there is one, it'll automatically push itself away. And then here, where we're saying that it should be text dark softer if it's published, which would be the disabled state, or text dark otherwise, then basically we want to change this whole thing to basically say this should have an isDisabled class added if it's published, right? If it's already published, then trying to publish it again should be disabled. And actually, that's not the right place to put that. That should actually be on the parent element, because that's basically what we're going to use to trickle down to a lot of other stuff. So this clickable option classes, we're going to be able to bake into the component a little bit more. So this is actually going to move up to here, and then we're going to nest this under it. Hate nesting, but when you have like a kind of tightly integrated component that has to interact with itself in a bunch of interesting ways, it's not really another option. And this will be the exact opposite, right? So this one will be disabled if the product is not published. So I think we can copy this title stuff up here, keep the flex stuff though, because that's just because of the fact that we have an icon. We might promote that to be part of the component, we might not. We don't need this class stuff at all anymore. This text small thing will get replaced by this so that we can bake in the margin stuff as well, and also like have the ability to target it. So here we want to be able to say on hover, we want the BG highlight, but the text light is actually going to be in the title. and in the body. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else we're going to need to do there. I guess let's just kind of see how it feels. This stuff is kind of interesting, but actually we don't need this stuff in here. The border invisible thing, I might want to do that still. That's hard to say. I was trying to basically get it so the blue background would overlap the border color, so you don't have a gray border around the blue, which I thought looked really ugly. But let's just see where we're at. See, you can see that gray border that I hate so much here. So I think on hover, we probably do want to set this item to have invisible borders. So if you look, I have like a border invisible helper here. So let's just bake that in here. On hover, we'll do a border invisible. And just see if that kind of gives me the effect that I want. Yeah, that looks right. Now this one, if it's disabled, does that have the disabled class? Let's see. Man, CSS. Okay. So if it's disabled, then we don't want to apply these things on hover, right? What's the CSS not selector? Is this supported everywhere? So if we do hover, how does this work? If we do not is disabled, :hover, something like that. Does that seem like real CSS? Yeah. That's pretty good. So what if we look at this other product now? So draft, so this one's not selectable, but this one is. Sweet. Okay, I actually got to get running because I'm headed out to see a movie with my wife. But yeah, that was kind of an interesting journey on CSS utility to component extraction. I think what we ended up with here in terms of the CSS is an improvement in terms of simplifying things. Now that we're baking some more colors and stuff into these things, we might think about extracting like some of these decisions up into the Dropdown Button class. But other than that, I think the rest of the work to be done here is going to be on simplifying some of the conditional view-based logic in terms of like all this not published crap. I don't think we're even using this at all anymore, right? So that's good. But yeah, I think there's still some work to be done here. But maybe we'll get to that in the next one. So hopefully that was informative. It's kind of fun for me. And I'll see you on Tuesday if you're going to be around for another stream. All right. See you, everyone.